Good morning. I'm Rick Green, editor and vice president of news for the Des Moines Register here in Iowa. I want to welcome you to the Register's editorial board meeting. With us today is former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, Republican from Georgia, who obviously is pursuing the Republican nomination for the White House in 2012. Mr. Speaker, it's good to have you here today with us, sir.
Good to be here.
You have with us today various editorial writers, political columnists, political editors, as well as our pollster who's with us, just a chance to sit in a little bit. What we'd like to give you a chance to do, sir, is just kind of give us 2 or 3 minutes, kind of an opening statement about where the campaign is thus far and the message that you're trying to convey to the caucus goers of Iowa, please.
Well, I've campaigned on the premise that we have very, very large challenges, that we need solutions the size of our challenges, that we have to have a national conversation about those ideas, whether it's my idea or somebody else's. We need to talk through how we're going to get this country back on the right track. And that what we need is a campaign that focuses on a choice among solutions and among potential problem solvers to then focus on defeating President Obama. I mean, I've consistently said I only have one opponent in this race. That's President Obama. And I've got a number of friends competing to be the nominee, but they're not my opponents. And so my goal has been to talk about how to create jobs, how to balance the federal budget, how to reform Washington, how to return power back home, and how to meet both the economic and technological and scientific challenges of the future and the national security challenges of the future. And that's part of why yesterday, for example, I was at the University of Iowa talking about brain science, which is an area that has enormous potential, both to save lives and save a great deal of pain, to save an enormous amount of money, and to create a series of American export products that will be very high-value jobs that would in fact be part of an economic long-term growth pattern for the United States. So I know that's different than traditional campaigns. You know, one of the challenges has been that I'm determined to run a positive campaign, and of course that once you become the front runner, you all of a sudden everybody else decided the negative campaign is really fun. And so wading through the next few weeks is a really big challenge, because I'm going to stay focused on solutions and trying to communicate what we need to do as a country to be successful.
That runs counterintuitive to the Newt Gingrich we've known, watching you throughout your 53 years of your career. Why are you taking that tact and that approach this time around?
I think the country's in enormous trouble. And I think this is the most important election since 1860. And I think that finding a way to bring the country together is really, really important. I mean, I think the deadlock we now have is, not just in Washington, but in Sacramento, for example, I mean, is really, really debilitating to our future as a country.
Do you think you're the person who can bring the country together, given your reputation for divisiveness in Congress?
Well, I mean, first of all, my reputation for divisiveness included working with Bill Clinton to pass 4 consecutive balanced budgets, to pass welfare reform, to pass the first tax cut in 16 years. I mean, everything I got done, by definition, had to be bipartisan. It includes working with Ronald Reagan while Tip O'Neill was Speaker. Everything that we passed in the Reagan program, we had to get 1/3 of the Democrats to vote with us, because we were consistently having to outmaneuver O'Neill. And I think there's a huge difference between the public style, which was necessary, I thought, to create the first Republican majority in 40 years, and the ability to work across the aisle and work with Democrats. And that's why, you know, I've been advocating for months that the House Republicans pass the Webb-Warner bill, which would allow Virginia to develop oil and gas offshore. Because here are 2 Democratic senators offering an idea which fits where Republicans want to go. It's a great chance to be bipartisan. I was delighted in talking with Paul Ryan last night that he and Ron Wyden have introduced a new bipartisan approach on Medicare. I think that's takes a great deal of courage on Wyden's part to step out and be willing to introduce a bill of that kind. And again, it's a break in the ice. It's a chance to start having a more bipartisan conversation.
But in a lot of ways, the partisanship has hardened since you left office, and it appears to be unbridgeable. I just wonder, how do you think you can bridge it?
You know, this may be one of the virtues of having been around for a while. In 1979, 1980, there were all sorts of articles about, is the presidency too big? And then we elected Ronald Reagan. And all of a sudden, the presidency seemed exactly the right size. It was too big for Jimmy Carter. If you have the most radical president in American history, and I think if you start intellectually with the idea that Obama is a legitimate, authentic trainer of Saul Alinsky. I mean, when he said he was a South Side organizer, he didn't mean Boys and Girls Clubs. I mean, he was teaching Alinsky's model. And you say, and then you say, second, he's never run anything. I mean, this is a guy who sort of served in the state Senate while he was running for the U.S. Senate, and sort of served in the U.S. Senate while he ran for president, and turns out to be a terrific candidate. But he doesn't know how to do any of this stuff. I mean, it takes a very high level of skill to be able to get our system to work. The Founding Fathers designed it that way. And so I would say that you might see bipartisanship flourish if you had a president who, in fact, talked to the country. I mean, if I become the nominee, we will run an American campaign, not a Republican campaign. And we will reach out to, and I have Democrats. I have a friend who's a Democrat who's actually switching his registration to vote for me in the California primary. I mean, but I have people all over the country saying, gee, you know, you look at the speech yesterday at the University of Iowa on brain science. There are a lot of Democrats and a lot of independents who worry about Alzheimer's. They worry about Parkinson's. They worry about autism. Having a political leader who's willing, and I did, while balancing the budget, we did double the National Institutes of Health budget. So we really showed a willingness to set priorities, to be frugal in one place and make an investment in another. And I think that creates a potential for coalitions that are very different than people would traditionally think.
Mr. Speaker, I was watching Kathy Obradovich's conversation with you, obviously, just a minute or two ago, and we thank you again for doing that with us. But you said something that I scribbled down that I just was kind of taken aback. You acknowledged that you perceive yourself as a change agent this election, I'm not only a change agent, but I'm an outsider. How can you portray yourself as an outsider, considering your lengthy tenure in Congress and all the things you've been involved in with Washington? I'm just curious if you can explain that to us.
I'm not trying to portray myself. Look at the reaction of the establishment in both parties. They think I'm an outsider, because I am. I mean, I'm a person who has worked on issues for a very long time. I know the system very well. But I've always approached the system as somebody who wants to change it. It's a little bit like somebody once said, Ronald Reagan managed to serve as president for 8 years and was never in Washington. Now, obviously, that's not true, but we did a movie about him a couple of years ago, and we went out and filmed at the ranch. And he spent one year out of 8 at the ranch. And when I was at the ranch and spending time and talking to people there, you know, you begin to understand why he did that. Because he never became a traditional Washington insider. And I think it's fair to say, if you look at all the patterns I've had and the things I've worked on and the way I've done things, I've consistently been in the country much more than I've been in Washington in terms of the psychology of how you measure things. I mean, it's why when Strong America Now began to develop here in Iowa, I'd been studying Lean Six Sigma for most of my life. I actually did my first workshop as a congressman in the late 80s on applying Six Sigma to government. And had Motorola and Southwire and Cadillac and Ritz-Carlton at a congressional workshop on how to apply modern management to government. Trust me, in Washington terms, that's a very outsider idea. The idea of a speech on brain science, you know, is a very outsider idea. I think of myself as a bridge between both the public and the future and the insiders in the past.
You have written about George Washington. You've got the Washington flag on your lapel.
And this is a Washington tie from Mount Vernon. This is a Washington day for me.
So, are you modeling yourself on a Washington-style presidency, or which president would you say you would be like?
Nobody could model themselves on a Washington-style presidency.
Which president would you aspire to be like?
See, now you create one of those public relations challenges. If I compare myself to anybody, it becomes Gingrich is, you know, grandiose and thinks in terms of X, Y, and Z. And if I tell you no one, then you think Gingrich hasn't got a clue about American history. So, you know, all I'll say is there are presidents who've been very successful at communicating clearly core sets of values around which the country organized itself, and they're all worth studying. You know, and so you would study a Jefferson, a Jackson, a Lincoln. You would study Reagan, and look at how did they do it. There's a great book on Reagan called The Education of Ronald Reagan, which covers his years at General Electric, and it helps you understand how Reagan saw himself as an educator rather than as a salesman. And you go back. I actually did a speech at the American Enterprise Institute. I think it was in March of 2008, the 25th anniversary of the Evil Empire speech and the Strategic Defense Initiative speech, which were about 13 days apart. Because when I read this book, I suddenly saw his speeches differently. And I took these two as an example and walked through what he was trying to accomplish and what he was trying to do. It's a very similar pattern with Lincoln. A great book on Lincoln at Cooper Union, which is another book on Lincoln by Ron White called the Eloquent President. And of course Jefferson is a great writer. And what you see is people who thought of leadership as understanding where we have to go, communicating it clearly in a way that the American people said, yes, that's okay to do. Yes, I want you to do that. And then actually methodically implementing what that direction meant. And I think, so a presidency that would say, let's talk together about where we need to go, let's talk together about how we do it. That's why Kathy and I talked about the idea of teaching. I've talked to people at Kaplan and elsewhere about, could you teach an online course from the White House? You know, could you say to people, I'm going to outline for you the challenges I think we're faced with. I'd like your input. I'd like you to help us get there, which really first came to me trying to advise Governor Schwarzenegger's office on when they were in a total meltdown on the idea that maybe he should teach an online course for the people of California on the California budget. I mean, so that people could understand. You can't get that across in a 20-minute speech. And and yet the technology is now available to really dramatically expand public participation. That's why passing bills nobody's seen is not a good idea.
So I know that you're talking a lot about running against President Obama. So let's do a hypothetical. You're in the White House, you're president, a spy drone, military spy drone, has crashed and been captured by the Iranians. They're proudly and defiantly showcasing it around their country and talking about it. What do you say? What do you do? What's your reaction? And how does that contrast with what the president currently is doing, sir?
Well, they had several, they had a period of time, I won't say how long, they had a period of time when they could either have destroyed the drone on the ground,
They being?
the United States government, or they could have sent in a team to pick it up. And I think I would have said, the second I knew it went down, I would have said, which of these two options do we need to use? And in a worst case, you just destroy the ground. You'd take whatever steps were necessary to make sure that it got obliterated.
What's your reaction to the way he's handled it?
This is a president who is not. This is part of why I wear a commander-in-chief flag.
Sure.
Washington had been commander-in-chief for 8 years. When he presided at the Constitutional Convention and they write the president is commander-in-chief, they actually knew what the term commander-in-chief meant. You currently have a president who's sort of an explainer-in-chief or a campaigner-in-chief, but he's not a very serious person about this stuff. I mean, look at the way he's made decisions about the drawdown in Afghanistan. They're purely political. Look at the fact that last week he met with an Iraqi delegation this week, which included a commander in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I mean, this is a person we believe has been actively engaged in killing Americans. And you just have to think, this is a president who's just simply not a serious person when it comes to national security.
So is it that he's not serious, or is that he is naive, or that he's inexperienced, or what specifically?
I don't think he takes it seriously. I don't think he understands the downside consequences. That if things go bad, they can go really, really bad. And I think it's a very big problem.
So if I am overseas, what can I expect from a Gingrich administration with you as commander-in-chief? How do you try to position the United States as a foreign power, and how might it contrast to the current administration?
I think you look at both Theodore Roosevelt's talk softly but carry a big stick, and you look at Reagan, Reagan was very clear about his long-term goals, but he was very careful about the use of force. And I would be very cautious about military force, because I think you always have to ask the question, and then what? Yeah, we have lots of power. We can use it. And then what? And I think very often you get into these things where it's easy to get in and hard to get out.
So could you argue that the president's trying to be very cautious about military force and how he's handling the situation?
You could argue that. But it's pretty clear. I mean, in the case of a very, very sophisticated drone, I suspect that there were, in fact, plans to destroy it. Because you wouldn't have a vehicle like that hanging out over Iran without some kind of contingency plan for losing these things. In the case, we had the same challenge with the helicopter that went down during the Bin Laden raid, where we have pretty good evidence the Pakistanis gave it to the Chinese. Well, that's not helpful long. If you let your competitors get 20 or 30 years of technology in one event, you are really gradually you're reducing the margin of your security.
You would have done more than asked for it back. Is that what you're saying?
The drone?
Yes, sir.
I wouldn't even talk to the Iranians.
So you're saying you would have sent American forces into a sovereign country on a military mission?
You had an American spy plane over a sovereign country because presumably you thought it was a dangerous sovereign country. And when it first went down, I believe there was a period when there were no Iranians around it. And during that period, the easiest thing would have been to destroy it. I don't know. I'm not privy to secret information.
Do you think they should have had time?
There should have been a contingency plan to take it out, probably with some kind of precision-guided munition.
I presume that we have these things flying all over the Middle East. Are we prepared? Or would you be prepared to have teams go in anytime one goes down within the window of opportunity?
If you think a country is dangerous enough that you have to have a spy plane over it, then that's a country you're prepared, obviously, to take some risk with because you're already putting a spy plane over it. Again, it depends on the circumstances. But in the case of that particular vehicle, I think it went down in a fairly remote area, and because it was apparently an accident that it went down.
You think? You don't know for sure?
Well, no one knows for sure, unless you
So
have.
how can you criticize that they didn't do it?
Oh, because very knowledgeable people have criticized it. I mean, people who are specialists in this area have said letting that thing fall into their hands without destroying it is a significant mistake. I mean, that's not my opinion. That's people who study this stuff.
Are there things you think the president has done well?
It's not a topic I work on a lot.
Anything come to mind?
Well, I mean, I actively was supportive of his effort to get more charter schools and to give parents more choice in systems that are bureaucratized and unionized and where poor children in particular are trapped in bad schools. And that's an area where I actively tried to be helpful.
Mr. Speaker, I read a biography of you either late last year or early this year. And one of the chapters was sort of dealing with this, how do you communicate core values clearly to the American public? This was written shortly after you left Congress. I thought these are the underpinnings of the Tea Party movement. And I wondered if you accept a role as being the father of the Tea Party movement and how you sort of see it, pluses and minuses, as it's played out.
Well, somebody said to me, I've not seen it, but somebody said to me that the Democrats had actually run an ad recently that went all the way back to 1995, and it sort of made me, the father of the Tea Party movement. There's a book called Taxpayers' Tea Party, which was written in 1994 by a constituent of mine who's now a state representative. And it was written at my suggestion. Rush Limbaugh did the introduction. And I actually participated in a tea party in Boston that year as part of the Contract with America campaign. So to some extent, yes, I think I probably had something to do with the resurrection of the Tea Party as a model. I'm very comfortable with the Tea Parties. Many of the folks who staff our campaigns, Andrew Hemingway, for example, who runs the New Hampshire operations, a Tea Party leader. We just had 2 votes in South Carolina. In Myrtle Beach, the Tea Party voted 75% to endorse me. And in, I think, Lowndes County, another Tea Party group voted 80% to endorse me. So I think we have a very heavily Tea Party infused campaign, and I like most of what they're doing, because when you talk to Tea Parties, they're studying the Constitution, they're studying the Declaration of Independence, they're reading the Federalist Papers. They have groups that get together to talk about what's the base of the American system. They want more respect for the Constitution, not less. So I think on balance that they've been a positive force.
You talk a lot about American exceptionalism. Can you define briefly what you mean by that?
Sure. American exceptionalism is the Declaration of Independence assertion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's a document which asserts that power comes directly from God to the individual American. The individual American is sovereign. We loan power to the government, which is why the Constitution begins, we the people. It's why the New Hampshire state slogan is live free or die, which actually comes from a Revolutionary War hero's toast, live free or die because there are worse things than death, was the total quote. And I think that it's what makes us remarkably different from Europe. I mean, in Europe, you can be subjects to the government. In America, you're always a citizen. In America, the government should always be serving you. In Europe and in most parts of the world, governments expect you to serve the government. Fundamentally different attitude about the base of the system. And so it's the American system which is exceptional, not individual Americans. It's not an assertion of American egotism. It's an assertion of, I mean, it would be wonderful if other countries had as deep a respect for the rights of the individual as we do.
With your view of history, do you see comparisons between the civil rights era and the push these days for gay rights? There were lots of people in the South in the 60s who would never have consented to blacks and whites marrying. That's become the law of the land. There are lots of gay folks who see themselves in the same predicament. Talk about that.
I think there's an enormous difference between an inescapable fact of race, and you have to decide whether or not you're in fact going to tolerate discrimination based on race, and a question about culture, a question about what are your values. I think marriage is between a man and a woman. That's a value proposition. I think that it's very important for society to try to emphasize that relationship. I think people growing up in a structure in which children have parents that they look up to and parents they relate to is a very important thing. And I think there's a big difference between saying that you are going to have an acceptance of people's lifestyle and saying you're now going to normalize that as the standard for the whole country. And I think that the fact is I'm a traditional classic conservative, and I'm defending a value system which has a several thousand-year history behind it, and which is pretty clear. And I think that almost nobody who studies that value system has any doubts about the clarity.
A lot of people in the South in the 50s and 60s would have said mixed-race marriage was a cultural thing that they couldn't accept at the time.
Well, you can always make parallels if you want to. I don't accept that parallel. I think that it is fairly ludicrous. Nobody is suggesting that we have legal segregation of gays. Nobody is suggesting they not be allowed to use the bathroom, they not be allowed to drink at the water fountain. I mean, segregation was a horrible thing. And I grew up, I was born in Pennsylvania. I grew up in an integrated U.S. Army. I arrived at Fort Benning when I was a junior in high school. Segregation was still legal. It was a totally different thing. And I think that it is frankly offensive to have this whole effort to draw the contrast and to say, if you feel strongly about marriage between being a man and a woman, gee, is that parallel to being a racist? The answer is no. I mean, I'm defending a 3,000-year tradition that's very deep in our culture for very profound reasons.
But marriage is about to be a minority status in this country, marriage between
and
men
that's
and
a
women.
problem.
Is there something as president you would see that you could do to turn that tide if that's what your value is?
Well, I think part of it is to try to make it, to shift the benefit patterns economically so there's a greater benefit to being married. I mean, I think if you look at the impact, you go back and look at Moynihan's original warnings on this topic 40 years ago. And by every criteria, the breakdown of the family has gotten worse. The number of children who are growing up rootless and without any kind of adult supervision has gotten worse. And yet, Moynihan was roundly attacked for having said things that are now patently true and very clearly obvious. And I think Santorum's actually onto something important here, that finding a way to create a positive environment to maximize the desirability of marriage being the central building block and family being the central building block of society is a very important step we ought to take.
But apart from gay rights, apart from marriage, you say you support equal treatment of gay Americans.
I'm against discrimination against people based on their private behavior.
So what is your position on the don't ask, don't tell policy?
That would be my policies, don't ask, don't tell. Again,
in the military, you have a separate.
I don't think in the military that you particularly want sexual behavior to be an overt issue.
So you would not have wanted that repealed?
I would not have wanted it repealed.
Would you try and reinstate it?
I would sign reinstating it, sure.
Would you actively work to get it
Well,
reinstated.
I would encourage the Congress to pass reinstating it, and I suspect the next Congress will pass reinstating it.
Do you, Mr. Speaker? do you
And by
believe-
the way, when the President moved in the opposite direction, the two major ground combat forces, the Army and the Marine Corps, were both deeply opposed.
They aren't now, though.
They aren't now because they respond to the Commander-in-Chief. And, you know, but if you
So
went
they're
out
not
when
telling
you
the
went...
truth? I mean, they're not telling their true feelings about it?
Well, I think fairly often when you're in the chain of command, you ultimately there's a way to ask the question just right. But the truth is, I think that it would be a career-ending conversation.
Mr. Speaker, you mentioned race earlier being inescapable. Do you believe that being gay, that people choose to be gay?
I believe it's a combination of genetics and environment. I think that both are involved. But I think people have many ranges of choices. And part of the question is, do you want a society which has a bias in one direction or another?
So people then can choose one way or the other?
I think people have a significant range of choice within a genetic pattern. I don't believe in genetic determinism, and I don't think there's any great evidence of genetic determinism. There are propensities. Are you more likely to do this or more likely to do that? But that doesn't mean it's definitional.
So a person can then choose to be straight.
Oh, look, people choose to be celibate. People choose many things in life. There's a bias in favor of non-celibacy. It's part of how the species recreates. And yet there are a substantial number of people who choose celibacy either out of religious vocation or for other reasons.
So gay people should choose celibacy?
I didn't say that. I said people have many choices within genetic patterns. It is not a predetermined either or.
Let's go back to something that Kathy mentioned to you a little bit ago in the conversation with her about our most recent Iowa poll, our late November Iowa poll. It took a look at asking caucus goers, likely caucus goers, about the likelihood for a scandal in the White House. Herman Cain topped the list at that time. You were second, pretty strong second, and distant from everybody else. Why does that perception exist, do you think? Why would caucus goers feel that way?
Look, I've been very open about the fact that I've done things in my life that I'm not proud of, and I've done things I've had to ask God's forgiveness for, and I've had to seek reconciliation. And I've made no bones about the fact that if you measured me only on the past, you might decide not to vote for me. If you measured me on who I am now as a grandfather, and as somebody who at 68 has learned a lot, you might decide to vote for me. And in that sense, I've been very open about it, and I think very, very willing to have people ask questions and try to deal with it. That's part of what I bring into the race. Every candidate brings pluses and minuses. That's one of the minuses in my candidacy. And what people have to decide is are the pluses of very large solutions, of having actually balanced the budget, actually gotten things done in Washington, my sheer persistence, the fact that I'm still here when everybody thought I would be gone in June and July. Do those things add up to somebody who'd be a good leader? And I think people have to render judgment, and they will.
Mr. Speaker, the House ethics charges where you were reprimanded and paid a $300,000 fine, most of those were in essence overturned by later IRS rulings and court rulings, but what stuck was that you had provided false information to the committee. How did that come to pass?
I'm glad you said what you just did, because it's one of the most frustrating things in my career. All of the substantive issues, we were ultimately told we were right. It's just that it took 2 years. The IRS said we were right on one set of questions. The FEC said we were right. A federal judge said we were right. All of that was later. I mean, it's truly one of the most frustrating things in my career. The one thing that happened that was wrong is there was a single letter written by a junior attorney in a very prestigious law firm. And the very expensive lawyer I had hired had delegated it to his assistant, who then delegated it to a brand new assistant. The letter was technically wrong. There's no question about it. I shouldn't have signed it. And at the time, I was speaker. We were doing dozens of things. And I scanned it. It didn't leap out at me. It had been done by this very prestigious law firm that was charging an amazing amount of money. And I signed it. It was a mistake. There's no question. I technically wasn't fined. I paid the cost of the investigation. And now that you know that Nancy Pelosi was on the ethics committee at that time, you can appreciate how partisan the process was.
Do you regret paying the fine? Because that is out there on the record now.
Look, we were at a point where the Democrats had made clear that they either got to pound the flesh or this issue would go on for the entire term and it would have ended my speakership. Now, we hadn't yet passed the balanced budget. We hadn't passed the tax cuts. I mean, two-thirds of the stuff we got done after this was over. And so the question was I willing to go through the public embarrassment, which in retrospect, as you point out, was a lie. I mean, the things I was charged with, every single one of the substantive things I was charged with were overturned.
But the committee, which was bipartisan, and the House voted in a large bipartisan vote to sanction you.
Right, and I asked the Republican...
Was that a lie?
I asked the Republican... No, it was ending a problem that people like Pelosi had created, and I asked the Republican members to vote yes. And I said to them, we have got to get this behind us, because you couldn't get to the substance of balancing the budget,
So you don't think
cutting
they would have
taxes.
voted yes had you not asked them?
I think there were a lot of Republicans who were very angry about the way that it came down. And in retrospect, when you realize that the substantive charges are all false.
But some of them today are saying otherwise.
Not about that. They're saying otherwise. Look, I fully expect a number of Republicans who had a very aggressive leader who was determined to reform welfare, determined to cut taxes, determined to balance the federal budget. They might not have gotten their earmarks, or they might not have gotten their amendment, or they might not have agreed on how to get Bill Clinton to sign a bill. I mean, it's a very complex balancing act to be the most conservative speaker of modern times and get Bill Clinton's signature. Well, so you could lose people for a variety of reasons. I would just say to you that I'm fairly comfortable in an institution that currently has 9% approval.
So what would you...
To have some of them disapproving, it just further proves that I'm an outsider, because the insiders are very anxiety-ridden that I may show up.
Mr. Speaker, if I was going to go to a caucus on January 3rd and consider voting for you, one of the things that would really trouble me is that respected people, Senator Coburn, Senator Talent, have made no secret of the fact that they don't support you. In fact, they oppose you. They've called you arrogant and erratic based on their experience with you when they were in the Congress and you were Speaker. Does that trouble you? How do you answer those? How do you answer that?
No, I normally don't answer it.
Well, would you please?
I'm just saying, Senator Coburn's allowed to have his opinion. This is the guy who wants ethanol. Senator Talent, actually, I was told, was fairly awkward and embarrassed about the conference call he did the other day. He said he's an old friend of mine. I would just suggest to you that if you are aggressive enough to create the first majority in 40 years and to have it reelected for the first time since 1928, and in that process, if you are aggressive enough to reform welfare, the only major entitlement reform of your lifetime, and everybody talks about how do we reform the entitlements. Well, I did it. Okay, and that's a balancing act. And then if you are willing to actually write balanced budgets that Bill Clinton will sign, of course, hardline conservatives are going to say that's an impure budget. Well, they're exactly right. I mean, you want a pure budget, you ain't going to get Bill Clinton to sign it. So I am the most practical hardline conservative to serve in national office since Reagan. And I learned a lot. Reagan had this firm rule. If you can get 80%, take the deal. It's actually in our...
Their criticism was based on your leadership style.
Right, and my leadership style was to go down to the White House and say, I have to have this, what do you have to have? And the president would say, I have to have this. And I'd go back and I'd say, guys, here's the deal. Now, it's a leadership style. Okay? That's what they didn't like. There's an old rule in Congress, go along to get along. I had no interest in going along to get along. That's part of why I left Congress. When I was no longer capable of leading, it was time to go out and do something interesting, which I've done for 12 years. I've had a great life. But I make no bones for the fact that if you were a hardcore ideologue, or if you had pet projects that were your specialty, then I made you very uncomfortable. Because I actually wanted the most effective conservative government we could get.
You've talked about balancing the budget 4 times. That included some tax increases.
No, the tax increases were under Clinton before I got to be Speaker, and I voted against them. We balanced the budget. We balanced the budget while cutting taxes, but we brought unemployment down to 4.2%. I mean, I always tell people, if you want to get back to a balanced budget, get back to 4% unemployment.
Can we balance the budget now without tax increases?
Yes.
Or revenue increases?
Sure. No, revenue increases I'm for. I mean,
How do you get to revenue increases?
If you have offshore drilling of gas and oil, for example, you dramatically increase federal revenue. The guy who has developed North Dakota, which is on public land, private land, by the way, which is why North Dakota has 3% unemployment, because they wouldn't be allowed to develop it if it was federal land. But the guy who's the leading developer of North Dakota gas and oil said, if you applied what they're doing in North Dakota to the country, you get about $1 trillion in royalties over the next generation. So I'd start there. I gave a speech yesterday on how brain science could potentially save $6 to $8 trillion in Alzheimer's alone, forgetting autism, Parkinson's, mental health, etc., just in Alzheimer's. That's real money. I'm for more revenue by having people go to work. I'm for more revenue by opening up federal lands. We own 69% of Alaska. That's 1.5 times the size of Texas. You could give half of Texas to the environmentalists, and that would leave you an area the size of Texas to develop. Largest coal reserve in the United States is in Alaska. There are lots of things we could do to generate more federal revenue. They just don't require raising taxes.
I want to be sensitive to your time. I just had a couple really quick questions. I want to play off one that John said. So let's dismiss what's being said about you from your previous past, from those who were the insiders and folks who were on the other side of the aisle or in the Senate House, however you want to describe that. We know, based on all of our polling and the like, is that there is still an incredible number of undecided Iowans. All of us have talked to them. We have met with them everywhere from Starbucks to coming into our office and the like. And here's something that just crystallizes the question for you. I'm aware that he's helped balance the budget. I also know he shut down the government. I know that he reached across the aisle and worked with the president, but he also sat on the couch with Nancy Pelosi and talked about environmental standards. He's incredibly historic in nature. He knows history and world affairs, but yet he is one who is quick to perhaps speak before he thinks. Which Newt Gingrich are we getting is what a lot of Iowa's caucus goers are asking, and can we trust him?
I think that's a very good question, and I think that people should resolve that before they make a decision. And I think all I can tell them is that I have spent 53 years trying to understand what America has to do to survive, how to explain it so the American people will give you permission to do it, and how to implement it if in fact you have permission. And am I more complex than most candidates? Yes. Am I more interested in ideas than most candidates? Yes. Am I more willing to reach out and try to find ways to work with Democrats? Yes. Is that what it's going to take? What they have to ask themselves is simple. If you think somebody without ideas, without experience, and without a willingness to be bipartisan can fix America, then vote for him. I don't think it'll work. I think it'll be a disaster. And I think we'll be more years of gridlock like we have right now. But if you think in this particular moment, given these particular problems, that having a 68-year-old grandfather who actually knows what he's doing and who's actually studied government for his whole life and who has proven with a 90% American Conservative Union voting record, campaigning for Reagan in the late 70s, founding the Conservative Opportunity Society. I mean, when people say I'm not a conservative, you almost have to wonder what planet they've been on. So, are there some challenges with the Gingrich presidency? Of course. I tell people I want them to be with me in part, not because, and I say this openly, I'll make mistakes. You can't have change on this scale without mistakes. But if you want to get America back on the right track, what I promise is we're going to be open to people telling us that's a mistake. We're going to be open to a collective ability to move forward in a way that I don't think any other candidate could possibly do. And so people got to decide. And I'm as an Army brat who watched his father serve 27 years in the infantry, I am content with the fact that this system, you ask about exceptionalism, this system allows a guy like me to say what I honestly believe. And then people get to render judgment. And I'm very comfortable with whatever judgment they render.
Great. Okay. Thank you for the Register for participating with us today, and best of luck the rest of the campaign.
Thank you. Thanks.